As you know, it's item number 1, President Obama, and it's very nice to say that. President Obama, in his very first act in the Oval Office yesterday morning, called up the leaders in the Middle East to talk to them about the crisis, and immediately everyone began speculating about in which order he had called the leaders to talk about the crisis. Welcome to your new job, Mr. President. And also welcome to your new job, Senator Mitchell, who has just been announced 2 hours ago as the special envoy to deal with the Middle East, and we wish him well. I'm Irish, as you might know, and I just told Ambassador Kurtzer, well, if he could bring peace to the Irish, maybe he can bring peace to the Middle East. He has said there is no such thing as a conflict that can't be ended, and we wish him well. This is a conflict in which you're all very familiar with, and so I'm certainly not going to go into any detail. But we've seen in the last few weeks, with all of the press footage and the statements back and forth, how what happens in a situation like this is that the extremists on both sides wind up dominating the issue, and that people who are more moderate often get pushed aside, and that makes it more difficult. The first reaction to President Obama's taking office was a statement from Hamas saying that he is not going to be able to bring change to the situation, that he's more of the same. So already the markers are being laid down. But change can take place. If you think back to 30 years ago, in the 1970s, the PLO was considered the terrorist organization par excellence. And everyone in the world was afraid of them and what they could and did do. And now, 30 years later, the PLO is our interlocutor of choice in dealing with the Palestinians. So it can change. Senator Mitchell was able to bring an end to the conflict in Northern Ireland that had gone on for decades, an extremely, extremely bitter family fight that he was able to find a solution for. So maybe change will come. One new element that I'm personally involved in, because I also do Turkish things, is that Turkey is now becoming a player in this area for the first time since the end of the Ottoman Empire. And there are very active discussions about perhaps bringing Turkey in either by itself or as the UN force to be a peacekeeper between Gaza and Israel, and Turkish public opinion is in a turmoil over this because of their own memories. And I'll quote to you your poem for today, which is a very plaintive Turkish folk song from the time of the First World War that is still very much sung in Turkey, that says, "Burası muştur, yolu yokuştur, giden gelmiyor, acep ne istiyor," which means this is mush. Its road is an uphill road. Those who go don't come back. I wonder why. And that was about the soldiers who went to Yemen in the First World War. So we're dealing with problems that come back again and again. Our speakers today will be led off by Ambassador Dan Kurtzer, because I checked the protocol book, and according to American government protocol, former ambassadors come right after bishops of Washington. And is there? No. So no Bishop of Washington today, so Ambassador Kurtzer will lead us off. And he, as you know, is the S. Daniel Abraham Professor of Middle Eastern Policy here at the Woodrow Wilson School and the former U.S. Ambassador to both Israel and Egypt. And he will be followed by Professor Amaney Jamal, Assistant Professor of Politics at Princeton and a graduate of my own other department, Near Eastern Studies. And she will be followed by Uriel Abulof, who is my colleague in the Liechtenstein Institute, a postdoctoral research fellow who has his degrees from the Hebrew University. And poor Professor Carl Brown, the Emeritus Professor of Garrett Professor in Foreign Affairs, also from Near Eastern Studies, will have to put together everything that they've said and bring us to some kind of conclusion. I want to remind everyone in the audience, even though this is a very impassioned topic, that we are here to discuss the conflict in Gaza and not to reenact it. So when you ask your questions and answers at the end, I would ask you to please try to put your emotions aside and bring your logic and positive proposals forward. So with that, I will turn the microphone over to Ambassador Kurtzer.
Good evening. I wanted to start off with an unsentimental, hard-headed analysis of interests, goals, tactics, and implications. I thought it would be useful in that respect in terms of setting the stage for us to understand what happened and what implications there may be from this conflict for the pursuit of peace in the Middle East. A couple of weeks ago, I had the opportunity to talk to a group of students at the Center of Jewish Life here on campus, and I compared the competing and contrasting interests of Hamas and Israel in this conflict to the Monty Python routine of the 100-meter dash for runners with no sense of direction, where the starter shoots off a gun and the 8 runners head off in totally different directions. And it raises the critical question in the conflict: if you don't know where a finish line is, how do you know when you've won the race? So with that, what I thought I would do is look at what Hamas's interests likely were in this conflict, what Israeli interests likely were, and how the pursuit of those interests in the course of this conflict either yielded success for one or both parties or did not. Hamas's interests, especially from 2006 when it was elected as a parliamentary majority in the Palestinian Legislative Council, was surely over the past couple of years to demonstrate its capacity to govern, and thereby to legitimize or re-legitimize itself as the majority governing party within the Palestinian Authority. Now, in order to do that, Hamas would have had to demonstrate that it could deliver the goods to the population in Palestine, in Gaza in particular, because, as you recall, from the summer of 2007, after the very short civil war between Fatah and Hamas in Gaza, Hamas became the sole leadership, the sole government. And yet Hamas was not able to deliver those goods because Israel, for reasons that I'll discuss in a moment, had imposed something of an economic blockade on Gaza, and therefore there was a sense growing in Gaza that Hamas was governing at the expense of the population, and that its inability to sacrifice some of its organization's ideological and political goals in order to meet the needs of the people was somehow hurting it within popular attitudes. Now, while pursuing these objectives, Hamas also wanted to continue to burnish its credentials as a resistance organization, which is one of its raison d'etre. And in order to do that, Hamas, over the course of particularly the last 18 months in Gaza, undertook a rather massive importation of arms through, as we now know, this extensive tunnel network. Finally, had there been any possibility of success in the peace process, in the so-called Annapolis process, Hamas would have had an interest in trying to ensure that the process would not succeed without its participation. But since that process did not yield any kind of success, Hamas didn't have to exercise a veto or to try to play into peace process terms. So Hamas's interests were well defined, and periodically they needed to play out those interests in active terms in order to demonstrate what I would call the station identification effect, in order to remind Israel that there was a partner in Gaza that Israel did not recognize and therefore needed to take into account. Now, Israeli interests were in some respects the mirror image of Hamas's interests, but not entirely, as the Monty Python suggestion indicates. Israel clearly, from the moment of Hamas's election, wanted to undermine Hamas's capacity to govern, and was bolstered in this by the international community's support of the 3 conditions for recognizing and dealing with Hamas: that Hamas would be required to recognize Israel's right to exist, renounce terrorism, and to accept to implement agreements into which the Palestinian Authority had previously entered. So Israel found itself in a comfortable position in line with international community support. But Israel seemed during this period to go beyond this relatively passive approach and undertook a more active effort to try to undermine Hamas's rule. There's an article in, I think it's the current issue of Vanity Fair or the last issue of Vanity Fair, that suggests that this was not only Israel's policy, but also the policy of the United States, which was to actively undermine Hamas by bringing about either an economic distress that would cause the Palestinian people to want to throw off Hamas rule, and or to foment civil strife between Fatah and Hamas, in which, in the case of the Vanity Fair article, the suggestion was that the United States would arm Fatah in order to prevail in a civil war. Israel also, of course, wanted and needed to find an answer to the Qassam rockets that were being fired out of Gaza. There is no country on earth that would tolerate that kind of activity, and Israel didn't have an answer to it other than to respond with aerial attacks or a ground attack. And as we saw during the period just before the ceasefire came to an end, the Israeli military establishment did not want to undertake a major military operation to respond to the Qassams. And so you had a situation where, where the country is demanding a response and the military says it does not want to go in militarily, which tells you that there is no response, and yet it was a problem for the Israeli system. Finally, it's been suggested, and there's probably some truth to it, that since 2006, the end of the Lebanon War, Israel was looking for some method of restoring so-called deterrence against or vis-a-vis the Arabs. The idea being that if Israel was perceived to have lost the war in 2006 or to have weakened in its resolve, this would give Arab adversaries some cause for wanting to provoke Israel. And in fact, the longer Israel didn't respond to Qassam rockets, the more Hamas and Hezbollah spokespeople could say that Israel, in fact, had lost the capacity to respond effectively to military threats. There were, of course, two immediate precipitants to conflict. In early November, about a month before the ceasefire ended, Israel attacked a tunnel being constructed by Hamas between Gaza and Israel. This is not one of the tunnels that was being used for smuggling, but rather it was a tunnel that Israel charged was going to be used by Hamas to try to kidnap Israeli soldiers, to join Gilad Shalit, the kidnapped soldier, and to give Hamas increased bargaining leverage in the prisoner exchange negotiations. As a result of the Israeli action against that tunnel, the number of rockets spiked considerably. The immediate precipitant, however, took place as the ceasefire, the 6-month ceasefire, expired, and Hamas decided not to renew it, and in the immediate aftermath launched an increasing barrage of rockets against Israel, which within a week prompted the major Israeli military action. Having analyzed these interests, the question is whether or not both sides or either side or neither side achieved those interests as a result of confrontation. A confrontation that I would suggest both sides understood was going to happen at some point. First of all, from the Israeli perspective, there's no question that Israel demonstrated once again a military dominance vis-a-vis an Arab adversary, in this case Hamas, and demonstrated it in a manner which is designed or has been designed to try to deter any future activity on the part of Hamas or others. One recalls in this respect the statement made after the 2006 war by the spiritual leader of Hezbollah, Sheikh Nasrallah, who said at the time, after the war, had I known or had we known that Israel would have responded the way it did, we would not have launched the operation that precipitated this. Interestingly, yesterday, an Egyptian newspaper quotes Khalid Mashal, the external leader of Hamas, saying the exact same thing. Khalid Mashal is quoted in an Egyptian paper yesterday as saying that we assumed this was going to be a very short military engagement, that the Arab world would erupt in such a manner as to prompt the United Nations to force the conflict to end. So you have, in a sense, an admission of miscalculation, strategic miscalculation, and in a sense, a confirmation for Israelis that the strategy of responding quite disproportionately to the precipitant of violence may have, in fact, accomplished its purpose. Israel inflicted considerable damage on Hamas's infrastructure, killed a large number of Hamas fighters. The numbers game is going to be played out for quite some time. The Gaza sources are indicating about 1,200 killed. There's an Italian newspaper today that's reporting that that number is 600, and that the vast majority of the 600 are, in fact, Hamas fighters. I don't know which is true. A large number of people were killed, and a large number of those people were Hamas-affiliated personnel. Israel also inflicted significant damage on the supply routes for Hamas's smuggling and on Hamas's indigenous rocket-making capability. For Hamas, the key was survival, and Hamas survived. The objective for Hamas was to emerge from their bunkers the day after this war, to probably fire off that last salvo of rockets that we saw that they did fire off, and to announce that they are alive and well and continuing to govern in Gaza. Hamas demonstrated that Israel could not, would not, did not deliver a knockout punch. And in fact, this war probably demonstrated that in this kind of asymmetric warfare in the Middle East, neither side can deliver a knockout punch. Humanitarian crisis is of concern and has caused Israel, in a sense, far greater pain than it has caused Hamas, although the pain is being suffered by the Palestinian people, many of whom have lost their homes, many of whom are suffering injuries and wounds and family losses that can never be fully recaptured. It leads, therefore, to a set of questions about the implications, and with this I will conclude, that I then hand over to my colleagues to discuss and for us to discuss in the question-answer period. The first, which is already being raised in newspapers here in the States, is what to do about Palestinian governance, particularly in Gaza. Hamas demonstrated before this war that it really could not govern Gaza. Israel demonstrated that it would not allow Hamas to govern Gaza. And yet, at the same time, the Palestinian Authority has no capacity to govern Gaza. And so what does one do with Gaza? What does one do with Hamas? And what does one do in a context where, if one wants to keep the focus on the larger goal of a settlement, you have a divided Palestinian community, more divided than on the eve of this war. At this podium some time ago, I suggested that we had all lost our focus by putting conditions on Hamas rather than keeping conditions on the Palestinian Authority. And that in 2006, when the Palestinian Authority held elections, those elections should have legitimized the government that was elected, and the world should have expected that government to maintain the commitment of recognizing its partner Israel, of renouncing terrorism, and of abiding by agreements. Instead, the world extracted that commitment from the government and placed it on one of the parties in that government, Hamas. So one of the questions today is that a way out of this conundrum of what to do next? Is it possible to get back to a situation of saying we expect the Palestinian Authority to maintain the conditions under which it operated since 1994? And in that respect, it almost doesn't matter who's in charge as long as the politics and the political platform of the Palestinian Authority is true to the Oslo Accords, to the commitments undertaken by Palestinians 15 years ago. A second issue, of course, is what will the world do in response to the precipitants to this conflict? Because the reality is, if all we see is a reemergence of smuggling and a reemergence of the capacity of Hamas or Islamic Jihad or the Palestinian resistance groups to launch rockets at will, then all this war will have become is round 1 or 2 or 3 of a 15-rounder, or perhaps even a longer heavyweight fight. And so there is now an increasing onus on the world to come up with solutions to the the problem of smuggling. And that's why you see a U.S.-Israeli memorandum of understanding in which the United States has undertaken some obligations to try to deal with smuggling not at the end of the smuggling chain, which is the Gaza-Egypt border, but rather before the smuggled goods even arrive in Egypt. And it's why you have seen a very intensive exchange between Israeli and Egyptian leadership to try to deal with the smuggling that may elude the earlier attempts to stop it and get to the Gaza-Egypt border. Because unless the smuggling of arms, more sophisticated arms, can be stopped, there will be no incentive for a resistance organization that needs to prove its credentials from launching attacks again in the future. Finally, the consequence, and as Ambassador Finn indicated in his introduction, one of the consequences or implications for all of us is whether or not this war will represent a kind of roadblock in the search for a comprehensive peace settlement or a catalyst in movement towards that settlement. And the fact that President Obama has, in one of his earliest actions, appointed a very senior, very experienced and very successful Middle East envoy suggests that the administration's initial appreciation of this situation is to see the recent conflict as an additional reason to apply diplomatic activity in pursuit of a comprehensive peace settlement. There's a lot else that has to be done. There's going to be a range of ceasefire implementation issues that will come up, not the least of which will be how to assure that the rockets are not launched, if not by Hamas, then by other groups in Gaza. Secondly, there is a massive humanitarian issue that needs to be addressed and addressed immediately, including the reconstruction of much of Gaza's infrastructure. Third, there is a West Bank problem. West Bank was extraordinarily quiet during this war, but that quiet should not be confused with some kind of support for what Israel did. West Bank had been enjoying a period of some economic growth. There was some success in respect to the training of Palestinian police forces, but the weaknesses of the Palestinian Authority have now been laid open for everyone to see, and it suggests that some immediate action to increase the benefits for the West Bank may hold the situation under control. And finally, it means an immediate return to negotiations. Questions are being raised whether or not the idea of a two-state solution is dead. Of all people, Colonel Gaddafi has suggested yesterday in the New York Times a one-state solution, quite an amazing proposition. And there are others who are suggesting a three-state solution, Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank. I have also argued from this same podium that only a two-state solution works and that there needs to be a viable Palestinian state living in peace and security next door to the state of Israel for both societies to see their way through a long-standing conflict. And therefore, the urgency of using this most recent war as a catalyst toward moving toward a two-state solution is therefore the more urgent. Thank you very much.
Whichever. You can sit if you'd like.
Sorry?
You can sit if you'd like.
Oh, that's fine.
Whatever.
I'll talk from here. Thank you very much. I was asked today to talk on or represent the Palestinian narrative. And when I found myself putting pen to paper, I realized that there really wasn't one Palestinian narrative I can capture here, but there were actually three. One, there was the narrative of the Palestinian people. I think we need to talk about that narrative, irregardless right now of the strategic ramifications of what's happened in the last month. Then there's the Hamas narrative, and there's a Palestinian Authority narrative. And I think I'd like to pay attention to all three, but I want to talk about the Palestinian narrative and to basically capture that that's what's happened in Gaza. And because we didn't see what was happening in Gaza in the Western media, for those of us who have access to Middle Eastern or Arab media, Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, all the Arabic media, what we saw was devastation, outright devastation, an attack on citizens in their homes, in their schools. 67 schools were destroyed, 5 UN facilities were destroyed. A lot of these two sets of institutions were used as civilian shelters. You have over 6,000 citizens that have been injured and injured severely, who have not been able to escape Gaza to receive medical treatment. Hospitals have been targeted. I mean, so what we do see in Gaza is indeed a humanitarian crisis, and it's one that's been induced by a very disproportionate military attack on an area that is not an independent state. It is not Lebanon. And it is not an Arab adversary. It is a strip of land that has a population, one of the most highly densely populated areas on the earth, and it has about, in every 1 square mile you have about 10,000 Palestinians residing in that area. So when bombs fall on Gaza, you know that they're falling on civilian targets, and that's the sad story that emerges from Gaza today. If you look at what pro-Palestinian writers are saying, like Rashid Khaldi in the New York Times, he said that he felt that the attack on Gaza was basically to remind the Palestinian people, the citizens, that they would always be a defeated people. And if you look at pro-Israeli writers like Thomas Friedman, he said in a New York Times op-ed, and I quote, and he was referring to the Lebanese incursion in 2006, but he said the only long-term source of deterrence that Israel has vis-a-vis the adversaries is to exact enough pain on the civilians. And if this indeed was an objective, and I'm not saying it is, the Israeli government hasn't come out and said this was the objective, to exact pain on the civilians. But if there is consensus that the civilians were basically, it was a reminder to the civilians that they shouldn't be supporting a Hamas government, and although as Ambassador Kurtzer pointed out, if we do track public opinion data from Gaza, support for Hamas has drastically fallen since the economic blockade, and what we find today is that support for Gaza, up until the eve of the attack on Gaza, support for Hamas in the West Bank was actually even higher than it was in Gaza, which for those of us who study Palestinian public opinion, this is not what you expect to see, because support for Hamas is normally located in Gaza. But going back to my point, if indeed the purpose was to send a message to the civilians in this manner, I question then how citizens can be targeted as the main source in this onslaught. And you know, Hillary Clinton, what she said today, she said it's about time that the United States stand up and take the moral high ground and show to the world that it cannot use tactics that then terrorists can justify using back again. And if we think citizens are fair game, that's what terrorists have been saying, and that's not a fair game, and that's not the type of politics that I think we should be engaged in, especially for me as a person who has been very passionate about the peace process. I'm very demoralized to see that this is where we are today. So there's the Palestinian narrative. And then going back to a Hamas and Palestinian Authority narrative. And first of all, I just think I need to respond to something that's been said over and over in the media here, is that, yeah, Israel has to respond to missiles being thrown from Gaza into Israel. And of course, any country needs to defend its citizens, and any missiles that are attacking its citizens, a country needs to stand up and stand against. But one needs to say, you know, yes, there's self-defense, and then there's self-defense. Did the disproportionate use of violence in Gaza, especially when we look at the outcome that we have today, right? Where are we today? We had an Israeli unilateral declaration of a ceasefire at the end of all this, and a U.S. commitment to monitor arms smuggling. And my question is, could that have been attained without killing 1,300 Palestinians? And these are the figures being reported from Palestine, and causing the devastation. CNN reported today that Jabalia was like at the end of times in terms of the devastation it sustained. Couldn't we have received or gotten a U.S. commitment to monitor arms smuggling and before going into Gaza with this degree of this just outright degree of military force exercised on that territory? So one has to question that as well. Now, going back to the Hamas and the Palestinian Authority narrative, and just really talking about the Palestinian Authority, if anybody has been totally weakened and ridiculed and humiliated, and both on the Arab street and the Palestinian street, it is the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, has been criticized more severely than he ever has before. He does not have the Palestinian street now. Now, I don't know what will happen in 2 or 3 months, but certainly he's seen the accusations against him in the Palestinian street and in the Arab street is that he's an outright collaborator. And in fact, he's being accused of basically being silent for the first one to 2 weeks of the whole attack in hopes that Israel was actually going to take out Hamas. So that's not an easy accusation to sustain if you're trying to lead your people through a very arduous peace process. And then the question becomes, well, how did the PA become so weakened, right? Mahmoud Abbas is there because he was legitimately elected as the Palestinian president. The Palestinian people wanted him there in power. But we then have to go back and just, look at the facts. The U.S. and Israel have done very little to politically empower the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority, day in and day out, year in and year out, have gone back to their people with making no progress on the peace front, all the while the West Bank has become more engulfed with settlements, more engulfed with checkpoints, and more engulfed with the security wall. And there's no future hope to see a Palestinian state emerging on the West Bank. So what is basically Mahmoud Abbas, what does he become to the Palestinian people? He's become an entity that will receive U.S. aid to basically try to keep the status quo. I mean, he's the status quo type of president. There will be no Palestinian state. If there's a peace process, that's fine because that's what his job is. And if there's a process of, at least his entourage all have jobs. I mean, and this is not a good way to try to empower leadership. Then we turned to Hamas. And how did Hamas appropriate the Palestinian street? Well, again, it was, Hamas did have popularity, but Hamas never had the outright Palestinian majority popularity. It only won 44% of the Palestinian popular vote in the 2006 elections, but because the foreign observers and those involved in setting up the Palestinian electoral system decided to create the most democratic system for the Palestinians. And there were too many people running on the Fatah list as well. Basically, Hamas ended up with 72% of the seats in parliament. So that needs to, because oftentimes what you hear is that basically the Palestinians, quote unquote, deserve what they got since they elected Hamas. And it's not that when they voted for Hamas, they weren't voting against Israel. If we look at all public opinion data that came out from the Hamas election, Palestinians were voting against the Palestinian Authority. They were upset with the Palestinian Authority. This was a corrupt Palestinian Authority. This is a Palestinian Authority that has not been able to deliver, and they voted against their own authority. And when we even look at public opinion data and we look at those who supported for Hamas, whether or not they support a two-state solution, what you find is that there's ample support among the Hamas voters. I mean, Christians voted for Hamas on the West Bank in the 2006 elections, which leads you to believe this was not a vote against Israel. But then you have, of course, Hamas's major source of support was on Gaza. Then you had a unilateral disengagement from Gaza, another unique opportunity to empower the Palestinian Authority. Israel left Gaza, and it left it out to the warring factors. Then, and it was at that point in 2005, there's been talk about a ceasefire and an enduring ceasefire, and Khalid Mish'al had put on the table a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas where the borders would be open and there would be some type of European monitoring of the borders against smuggling. That wasn't put into effect. But what we did see, and what oftentimes also is not really, that we don't pay attention to, is that there was a period of calm. There was a tahdi'ah, there was a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel from June of this summer till December, but really it really did end during the first week of November. And during the 4 good months of the Tahdi'ah, what we saw were only 20 Qassam missiles fired into Israel during that time. Even the Israeli intelligence reports reported that Hamas was going after the fringe groups to stop the missiles going into Israel. This is the Israeli intelligence report saying this, that Hamas was literally trying to rein in all the splinter groups. So this was in effect. And then the ceasefire broke through, not only because Hamas wouldn't sign, because Hamas also was demanding that the borders be open. Remember, the citizens of Gaza have been under economic blockade. 80% of the citizens of Gaza are dependent on external aid for their daily subsistence. This is a strip of land that has 1.5 million citizens. It needs to have access to open borders for healthcare, for food, for aid. This is an economically depressed society. So what this shows is that what direct engagement or indirect engagement and agreements and political negotiation can accomplish perhaps is much better than what military power can accomplish. And in my opinion, there is no military solution to this conflict. There will only be a political solution to this conflict, which means that there needs to be some type of engagement with Hamas. Now, Hamas is proposing that there be a unified government between it and the Palestinian Authority. Now, remember, the Palestinians wanted a unified government when Hamas emerged as the legitimate winner of the 2006 elections. What was the immediate response by the international community and Israel, as Ambassador Kurtzer pointed out? They immediately said, let's boycott, let's suffocate the Hamas government. We have to basically see what we can do to alter that result. What I didn't point out is that the Palestinians knew very well, the Palestinian Authority knew very well that if elections were going to be held, they weren't going to win the majority of seats because people were very upset with them. What the Palestinian Authority kept on pushing for was more progress on the peace front, and it was Condoleezza Rice who basically told the Palestinians, why do you guys keep on talking about the occupation? Why do you guys keep on talking about the occupation of human rights? Focus on democracy. Until the Palestinian Authority becomes democratic and Palestinian society becomes democratic, then we can talk about the two-state solution, right? So it's like this litmus. And what was the measure of democracy? Elections. So they pushed for elections. The Palestinian Authority lost. Hamas is in power. And now nobody wants to deal with Hamas. Then there were talks of a unified government between Hamas and the PA, which the Palestinians supported, and again, Israel and the international community boycotted, right? So then we ended up with what people often say is the two-state solution that Palestinians always thought would be different. Then you had the state in Gaza and the state in the West Bank, right? And Israel in between. So then today, what we have now is basically a weakened Palestinian Authority, what seems to be like an empowered Hamas leadership. During the crisis, 1,000 Qassam missiles were fired into Israel. That's while Israel was attacking Gaza. So I don't buy into the argument that the military capabilities of Hamas have been destroyed or harmed, or I mean, and quite honestly, let's be honest about it. What Hamas has been able to show is that if they're attacked here, they grow there. So there needs to be some type of political solution to this conflict, and this conflict can't go on. So now there's talk of a unified government, and perhaps this might go into effect, because as of now, there's been over $4 billion earmarked for Gaza reconstruction. Saudi Arabia pledged $1 billion, Kuwait pledged $2 billion, Qatar pledged in the area of $250 million. So that's almost $3.25 billion, plus there's been humanitarian assistance from all across the globe. That money has still yet to enter Gaza. And now what the international community is worried about is that Hamas is going to oversee the reconstruction process in Gaza, the rebuilding of the schools, the distribution of aid. And what is that going to mean? Hamas is going to become the only address in town. And this is what prompted Israel to declare a unilateral ceasefire. Livni was horrified by the fact that basically everybody was pushing them to deal with Hamas. So now humanitarian assistance to Gaza is being held up until this issue is resolved. And now Hamas is the only government in town in Gaza that has to oversee the reconstruction efforts. And we're talking about a population that is in dire need of aid. And it's all being held up because of this political stalemate right now. So in my opinion, in my assessment, just looking forward, unfortunately, I think Hamas has been empowered as a result of this. The Palestinian Authority has become drastically weakened. It's come at a huge civilian loss of life. It was not necessary. If the goal was to have a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel, it could have been accomplished without this attack. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Abulof.
Thank you. And good evening. When we decided last week, it was before the ceasefire went into effect, to have our meeting at 6 o'clock, I couldn't but think wishfully on the Israeli, rather popular phrase of meet you at 6 o'clock after the war. It is taken from a Czech book, Good Soldier Zweig by Jaroslav Hasek. And so here we are at about 6 o'clock after the war, although of course not quite so, because both sides do regard this war as merely yet another round in what is increasingly perceived, again by both sides, as an endless war. Initially I thought that I should begin with some contextualizing remarks about what we are expecting in the Middle East in 2009, which is, for me, three main trends. The unprecedented number of elections, relatively free and fair elections, to be held in the region, the economic crisis of the rentier and the semi-rentier state of the region, and the nuclearization of Iran. But I think that this wouldn't really allow me to get into the subject at hand, the conflict. But if you are interested in that, we have at the LISD my working paper on the subject, that I would welcome any comments on it. As to the conflicts, I would begin with some theoretical comments. And the main is that I think we can distinguish between three main grand approaches to conflict. The first two most popular ones are probably conflict resolution and conflict management. And in that sense, I guess that intractable conflicts such as the Palestinian-Israeli one are not really unlike terminal diseases. You can try to find the cure for the disease, or you can try to ease the symptoms. Hopefully you can do both at the same time, but since time and energy are usually limited, one grand approach usually dominates the agenda. There's also a third approach, which title might be called conflict transformation, in the sense that the aim is not really to end the conflict or even to ease the symptoms of it, lower the level of violence, but to change the conflict, to basically transform its fundamental parameters, taking into account that it is not only the sides that give rise to the conflict and change it, but they are also changed and transformed by the conflict, sometimes for the better. This is part of the argument of that approach. And I think that to a large extent, if we look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, all three approaches have been tried throughout the years. So in terms of conflict management, we have witnessed attempts at internationalization of the conflict. We've seen high-level diplomacy meant at mediation. We've also witnessed what Benjamin Netanyahu, one of the contenders for Israeli prime minister in the upcoming elections, called the economic peace, which is basically what Israel's policy was like up until the First Intifada, and it ended in the First Intifada. We have also seen attempts of conflict resolution. Obviously, one of them was through coercive battleground. Another strategy was through a negotiable middle ground, trying to find a compromise, utilitarian compromise between the sides. These strategies have also failed, and we have also witnessed attempts to conflict transformation. Recently, by Israel unilateral withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, from southern Lebanon, building the wall or the security fence around the West Bank. This has failed, and also another type of conflict transformation, which I call narrative dialogue, basically trying to tell each other the story of each community to reach better and mutual understanding So far to no avail. Peace continues to elude us. And my argument is that the way I see it, to a large extent, peace is elusive because the conflict is elusive. And by this, I don't mean that there is not a conflict. There is obviously a conflict, and the last month provided enough evidence of that. But this is not the conflict. This is not the conflict that we so often think about and speak of. And I'm saying this because I see three main gross misconceptions of the conflict, and I would like to outline them and conclude, if time allows, with what it means. And it means for me that there are indeed two roads not taken to solve the conflict. So what are the three major misconceptions? The first, the way I see it, is the fact that the conflict is framed in a very peculiar way as an almost interstate conflict. And this is why it is called the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. But obviously to everyone who deals with the conflict, it is quite clear that Israel itself is a framework for an internal conflict between Jews and non-Jews, most of them Arabs, and some of them refer to themselves as Palestinians. But this is not only an intrastate conflict either. So the usual way in which IR, international relations literature, deals with conflict, to be either interstate or intrastate, the latter being mainly civil wars or ethnic conflicts, this doesn't really apply to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think it is much better depicted as an intercommunal conflict, a Jewish-Palestinian conflict. Now, by this I do not mean that states and their borders are insignificant. Of course there are. But I think that they are secondary in importance to communities and their boundaries. And this should be the focus of our understanding. And this observation is all the more important because of the next two misconceptions of the conflict. And the second one relates to what I call the balances of might and right. Usually in the literature, it is very clear that if you look at the power balance between Israel and the Palestinian, Israel is much more powerful, right? In terms of military, in terms of its economic capacity, this is quite clear. But again, one error here is to treat Israel as a unitary unit, which is not the case. We should be looking more to what happens with the community, in that case, Israeli Jews. But even more so, and although objective circumstances, conditions, and parameters are of crucial importance, I would argue that there are less importance for our understanding of the conflict than the intersubjective dimension, the way that each of these communities perceive their situation. And if you look at the way that Israeli Jews perceive their own situation, it is quite unlike what the power asymmetry literature suggests. According to this perception, in a way, here I provide a kind of an Israeli narrative, although it is very oversimplified now. In a way, for Israeli Jews, it is basically sticking a finger in a dam against what appears to be a tsunami with many waves culminating from geography, contextualizing, again, the Palestinian issue in the larger region. So there is geography, there is demography, there is also, to a certain extent, geology, the profusion of oil in the Middle East. Military aspects are more and more prominent as Iran advances its nuclear project, and the armament of both Hamas and Hezbollah also advances. All these components and many more create an atmosphere among Israeli Jews that the survival of their polity, the survival of the Jewish state, is crucially at stake. And I think that without fully understand the weight of this perception, whether right or wrong, I do not refer to that here, we cannot truly understand the conflict and then solve it. But of course there is a flip side to that, and this is the side of the Palestinian. Now, whereas I do argue that the most crucial concern for Israeli Jews is the viability of their polity, I argue that for the Palestinian it is first and foremost the validity of their collective identity. And the reason I'm saying that is that in relative terms, Palestinian identity, and more precisely in my concern here is Palestinian peoplehood, is a relative novelty and therefore is quite fragile. The phrase itself, a Palestinian people, was only truly adopted in the second half of the 20th century, and only substantially so on the public sphere since the end of the 1967 war. This does not mean that there is no Palestinian people. Of course there is, because a people is basically a result of enough people saying that they are belonging to one people. But the fact that the identity is rather new suggests its fragility, and there are repercussions for that. So one repercussion is that if we look at public opinion polls, we can see that many of those whom we identify as Palestinian prefer to identify themselves as Arab and Muslim. The second issue is the internal division within the Palestinians. What the 1967 war did was unite all the Palestinians after the 1948 war. After the 1967 war, it was the only time that the Palestinians were actually in Palestine, that there was a sense of a whole community. But this sense was, in a way, undermined by the Oslo Accords. In 1993, by the external constraints that Israel put on the territories that were under the control of the Palestinian Authority, the division between Israeli Arabs and Arabs within the territories, within the Gaza and the West Bank, those divisions have developed. And in the latest round of elections since 2005, we have seen the results of that also between the West Bank and the Gaza. The third troubling aspect of the Palestinian identity fragility is that in certain circles that amounts to a negation of the other's identity. And by this I don't refer to the possibility that they will negate the fact that there are Jews. Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims as a whole do accept the fact that there are indeed Jews. But too many intellectual and members of the elites do not accept Jews as a people, as an ethnic community, and refer to them more as a religious community. And there are political repercussions, of course, because then they do not have the right of self-determination. And one of the latest manifestations of that was in Israeli Arabs' Future Vision document, in which there was no recognition that there is, in fact, a Jewish people, but rather there is what they called Jewish Israeli people. And therefore, of course, the law of return, which basically grants automatic citizenship to any Jews that immigrate to Israel, should be abolished. So what I argue is that because of this second misconception, there must be a way found to ease the problematic ingrained in the ethno-national Jewish Israeli polity and the problem of Palestinian identity. And this, I think, can be achieved through contextualizing the peace. In the case of Israel, I mainly refer to the role that both NATO and the EU should play in devising the peace. In the case of the Palestinian, mainly through the Arab world and prominently through the possibility of confederation after the Palestinian state will be established with Jordan. The last and most problematic misconception is that in the literature we usually refer to the conflict as being an ethno-national conflict. It is basically waged between the national Zionist movement of the ethnic Jewish people and the national Palestinian movement of the Palestinian people, both struggling for the same piece of land, be that Palestine or the land of Israel. Therefore, you should redistribute the assets, the territory. I do not agree to that description because although the Zionist movement is indeed an ethno-national one, I think that the Palestinian movement is much more land-based. The Palestinian identity is much more land-based. And there are repercussions for that. One repercussion is the very distinct relations of the two communities to their respective diasporas. The other, and since we're limited in time, I will focus on that, is the relations to the possibility of territorial compromise. It is precisely because the Zionist is primarily ethno-national movement for which land is only a marker of identity and not the maker of identity, that Zionism were able to conceive of a possibility of territorial compromise all along. This is why, at the beginning of the 20th century, the British Uganda plan was seriously considered. This is why Transjordan Autonomic State was formed in 1925 without really objection from the Zionists. This is why they accepted basically the Peel Commission plan of granting 25% of Palestine to the Jewish state. This is why they accepted the UN resolution, and this is also why, to a large extent, the West Bank and Gaza were never annexed to the State of Israel, and why Sharon was able to convince most Israeli Jews that this was the right move to go ahead and disengage from Gaza. And the basis of the argument was a demographic one. There needs to be a way in order to sustain a state that can be both Jewish and democratic, and the only way to do it is to guarantee a Jewish majority. Territory is important, but it is secondary in importance to that imperative. This is not the case for the Palestinian. For them, I would argue compromising land is potentially compromising the self, compromising their collective identity. And so if we are to look at the very widespread formula of land for peace, for most Israeli Jews, this means that Israel is granting to the Palestinian land in return for peace. For most Palestinians, and I do refer here to moderate Palestinians that do embrace this formulation of land for peace, it's basically the other way around. Palestinians are the ones granting Israel land, and almost 80% of their land, in exchange for peace, in the sense of peace of mind, being free of the occupation. And this kind of deep asymmetry, this kind of deep normative asymmetry, I would argue, is very hard to resolve. Now, if I combine, and with this I would conclude, if I combine my observation here that the conflict is both intercommunal and is both characterized by deep narrative and normative asymmetry, there can be only two ways to truly solve it. One way is to transform the conflict, to make it into an interstate one. And the way to do it is basically to establish a Palestinian state, not after the agreement, but before. It basically means establishing a Palestinian state tomorrow on the Gaza Strip, on most of the West Bank, say until the point of the wall, about 90% of the territory. The conflict will go on. There will be violence. But hopefully it will be more of an interstate conflict in which the leaders, the governments on both sides, will be able to make peace offers much more sustainable. The other way to solve intercommunal and normatively asymmetric conflict is to address the normative asymmetry. Instead of reaching a coercive battleground or a utilitarian middle ground, to try to reach normative common ground. Now, and I think that it was about 2 months ago that Itamar Rabinovich, the former ambassador of Israel to the United States, stated, I think it was here, that we need high-level diplomacy in order to curtail extremists, in order to curtail, to contain the radicalism. And this is usually true. High diplomacy of high-level negotiations is usually the way to go forth in interstate conflicts, not in intercommunal one. Because in intercommunal conflicts, what you have is basically the opposition, the radical opposition, having normative veto right on every possible solution. And as long as it is perceived as such, even by the coalition itself, even by the moderate coalition itself, there can be no solution. So there needs to be a way to find a new basis for legitimacy, for any solution. And the way to go forth in that respect would be for me to go for direct democracy. Elections are not enough. And as Amaney really pointed out very clearly, what we have seen in the elections is that other considerations, other than the conflict itself, are paramount in the voters' decision. What we do need here, in order to provide a normative common ground, is referendums. So my, I guess, radical, but for me also realist utopia would be to hold a kind of pan-Palestine referendum in which every resident from the Jordanian Sea to the Mediterranean would be able to cast its vote whether the end solution should be 2 states for 2 peoples, whether it should be a binational state or perhaps a Republican model. But as this solution will probably be unattainable in the near future, another way to go around it would be, for example, to state that the 2 governments will negotiate peace for a period of 1 year, by the end of which the peace will be offered not for elections, not only for the decisions of the government, but for referendums done in each and every side. By this, you may provide the popular sovereignty argument in establishing legitimacy for the future peace. The way I see it, other than these two routes, to transform the conflict into an interstate one, or to establish a common ground of normative consensus, which, again, for me is basically stating not just two-state solution, but importantly, two states for two peoples. It will be very hard, I think impossible, to reach peace. Thanks.
Thank you. Professor Brown, is this working? Is the mic working?
I prefer to remain seated, even though I might.
Can you hear him well?
No? Oh.
Yeah, I think these are working.
I was going to be a metaphor for Dick Cheney by remaining seated, but you didn't permit that.
Why don't you sit here?
No, that's all right. That's all right.
Oh, is that working? Yeah, you can sit here.
I think this.
And let's move in.
Can I speak here?
Yeah, you can sit.
No, it's all right. It's all right. You've been very patient, and I'm sure you're eager to have your questions and comments. And even though I've got notes galore, I'm not going to go through any of that. I'm just going to quickly make a couple of points. One thing, which is just, I always sort of like to the extent possible, visualize what we're talking about. And I have just the following about Gaza. It really is a strip. It's 25 miles long, and between 4 and 7.5 miles wide. Its borders are the Mediterranean, just short of 7 miles bordering Egypt, and some 32 miles bordering Israel. It's 139 square miles, which is to say almost exactly 3/4 the size of Mercer County. It has a population of almost 1,500,000, as opposed to Mercer County's 368,000. That figures out to roughly 10,665 people per square mile in Gaza, as opposed to 620 per square mile here in Mercer County. Per capita income, which I think is a little high, $600 per capita for Gaza, $49,000 for Mercer County. It is also a very young population. It's estimated that roughly 45% of the total population is aged between beginning and 14 years old. 14, not 15, 16, 17, 14 years old. Of that 1.5 million, roughly 1 million, 2/3, are refugees or have refugee roots. Now, just a couple of other things, and then I'm going to sit down. As I counted, thinking now as a historian, in the last 60 years, we've had 8 wars: 48, 49, Suez, 56, Six-Day War, 67, War of Attrition, 69, 70, Yom Kippur, Ramadan, October War, 73, the first of Israel's invasions of Lebanon, 82, 2006, and now 2008, 2009. I'm sure I must have missed one, but that's that's enough, I think, in any case. In that same period of time, we've had 8 wars and 6 Nobel Peace Prizes, all connected with the Middle East. So the wars are ahead of the peace prizes slightly, but we're getting in there. Now, does that mean a certain cyclical thing? We're getting nowhere? No. Even though we're now all stunned and horrified by the recent war of these last 20 or so days, I put it to you that things have gotten better, and even now, as we look out at it, I'm not going to rehearse. I'm not going to object to the points already very clearly put out by the other panelists. But I do think we can say that there is some progress. There is peace between Israel and Egypt. It's still holding. There's peace between Israel and Jordan. The Gulf states, certainly Qatar has shown a very interesting role in these kinds of relations. Also, if we, even that somewhat amazing op-ed by Colonel Gaddafi today, if you look at the speech, all the things made, it's not at all like the rhetoric of the Arab rhetoric of so much earlier. It's kind of an interesting thing. It's almost showing two sides together. Now, I think, in conclusion, that I certainly don't want to be Pollyanna-ish and say the war was all for the good. It's going to be better in spite of the horrible loss. No, there's really very good reason to say this is going to be a setback, but there is the possibility of cobbling things together even after this terrible war. And it was terrible. We've all seen enough of the on our TV screen, our newspapers and so on, to realize just how terrible it is and how avoidable it was. But still, we've got to go back and look at where we are now. Can we possibly build on it? I think we can, meaning the people of the region and the world community, with certainly a certain position to be taken by the United States, a very important position. But here, another caveat, and at this point I would call to your attention, I'm going to close with a reading list. I was notorious for that. When I was a member of the active faculty, students would ask a question, and I'd give them a reading list. And that's what I'm going to try to do right here, too. I commend to your attention the most recent report of the International Crisis Group. International Crisis Group, you can Google it and get it. You can download it free on this subject. I would also point out to remind ourselves that if we can call it even now in these dark days progress, we can at least say it's not. I mean, we have to concede it's certainly not linear. It's forward and backward and forward and backward. And I would also warmly recommend a little book by Galia Golan. That's Galiagolan. And I'm looking, I'll get it in a minute. Anyway, Galia Golan, in this day and age, all you have to do is just pull up the Princeton University Library and you get the... And I would also, this was not prearranged, I also commend to your attention the recent book by our panelists, Dan Kurtzer and Scott Lizinski, how Israeli... Negotiating Arab-Israeli peace, which is sensible, down-to-earth, and really very solid. That said, one more thing I want to mention, the review by Robert Malley of the books, the most recent books by Aaron David Miller, Martin Endick, and the book by Dan Kurtzer, the very long review by Robert Malley in the New York Review of Books, in which he argues, Robert Malley and Hussein Aga, they wrote it together. They argue very cogently that the Obama administration must be very careful not to get too up front in moving in now to try to do something about this. One statement from that review struck me. The surest way to diminish Obama's appeal to the region would be for him to present a plan with no real future in the company of leaders burdened by their past. We need right now a very subtle negotiating style, a serious and subtle negotiating style with the United States to some extent in the background, or at least to this extent of making sure that we get others involved. And not go for another Camp David, not get caught up in those things. And also, this is a hard thing to say in this, I'm going to catch it for this by some of you, but we need to move toward, a move away from this knee-jerk support of Israeli actions year in and year out. That is manifested especially in the Congress. And this is a pro-Israeli statement that I'm making. I think that needs to be done, and if only for that reason, read my reading list, mull over what my panelists have said, and let's move on from there. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. This has been very interesting so far. Ambassador Kurtzer and Professor Jamal have given us different ways of looking at the question of how do we put Humpty Dumpty back together again from different points of view. And Professor Abulof has asked the question of what is Humpty Dumpty made of in the first place. And that's a very good thing to do, to look back at the basics and see if that may give us a clue as to how we can move forward. And Professor Brown very rightly cautions us that yes, we can, but be careful how we do. It's a time of new beginnings, but we can make mistakes. So I think we've had a good four-dimensional way of looking at this very disturbing question. And now I would be happy to take questions from the audience. But as I cautioned earlier, please try to ask real questions and not make polemics. Yes, the young man in the back. If you want, you can come down and speak in the microphone. Maybe that would be easier than shouting, or maybe you like to shout.
This question is for any panelists that wants to tackle it. What role do you see religious leaders in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza playing in forging a comprehensive peace from here on out?
Yeah.
We have no problem with the
No one wants to take it. No. Next question? No.
I think that the potential for interreligious or interfaith dialogue is limited at best. They have been attempted at in recent decades. All have failed, mainly due to the fact that although they can agree on stuff like, preventing gay parades, etc., there is a deep strife between the two communities that even the best religious understanding can, at best, only ease, but not, I think, solve.
Robert?
Yes, dear.
Yeah, I will take a slightly different approach than Uriel. I don't think that religious dialogue is a panacea, but there's a need for it. We saw 7, 8, 10 years ago something called the Alexandria process, in which religious leaders came together and actually agreed on a statement. The problem is it had no follow-up. Recently, the Saudi Arabia has tried to construct a religious dialogue that would actually not just be a one-off activity, but might carry back into the communities where principles could be agreed upon that would then find their way into synagogues, churches, and mosques, and into the schools of the various communities. So I don't want to give up on the idea of religious dialogue as a component or complement or some added value. I don't think it substitutes for dealing with the issues of politics and territory and narratives, but without it, you have a backdrop in this conflict of religious strife, and so at a minimum you need to neutralize that and perhaps make religion into a helpmate rather than a deterrent.
Yes, ma'am.
The question was what advice I would have for George Mitchell. This is a trick question. I'll tell you why. I just completed a stint on the Obama transition team for the Middle East, and I think it would be appropriate to have a little time pass between completing that stint and providing that advice in public. So I will tell you that the President-elect heard some things from our team that some of them, in fact, have started, some of the phone calls and so forth, and I will not directly answer the question.
Okay. Yes. Any other questions? I'm sorry. Yes, sir.
Come on down.
Our famous portable microphones. This is part of the new economy at Princeton University.
Here's my comment. It seems to be too coincidental that this crisis came just when the United States is changing its leadership. I know that Hamas provoked Israel at this time, and I think that they really did expect a Lebanon-type reaction from Israel, even though someone said that they didn't. Do you think that they wanted to see a fresh look at the situation under new United States leadership? That's my question. Why this thing is happening at this moment, because I think Hamas or people from Gaza are looking for a new solution. Maybe under Obama we'll see something different.
I don't, there are two elections. There was ours, and there's the Israeli election coming up in 20 days. And, there have been suggestions in the papers that the timing and scope of Israeli action was geared to getting something done before a friendly administration left office, finishing the occupation of Gaza before the new administration came in. I don't buy it, because had the ceasefire been renewed, or had the 6 months of the ceasefire covered this period, we would not have had a war. I mean, we found ourselves in a situation where a ceasefire that began in June had a 6-month termination date, and it was terminated. So I think the kind of, I don't want to call it the devil's theory, but it is a little bit of a devil's theory, that it's tied in with electoral calculations here in Israel, is a bit of a stretch in this case.
Yes, sir.
My question is to Ambassador Kurtzer. Amaney and Uriel have both spoken about two different types of approach, but they seem to be based upon an idea that there be either a unified government or a Palestinian state. And the question that I have is that it's clear that all of the aid money is not going to be allowed into Gaza as long as Hamas is the governmental entity in Gaza. Do you think that the United States, if there was a unity government, would then force the Israelis as well as others to recognize that government, and then to allow the aid to go in to be used by both some sort of agreement between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas?
Well, there's a lot of ifs in the question. I think the first question that the United States is going to have to confront, along with the international community, is the question raised by Amaney, which is you've got this backlog of aid commitments, and you have a political roadblock which says we don't want to fulfill those commitments until there is a governing authority with which we're prepared to deal. Interestingly, it's not the United States that's unwilling to fulfill the aid commitments alone. It's also Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and other parts of the Arab world. There is concern, not just in the West, about having Hamas deliver the goods as a result of this war. So, in a sense, you're almost faced with a need to deal with the politics because of the pressing humanitarian issues involved. I don't know if there's a way to escape that. Traditionally, you could escape it by having aid delivered through international channels, through United Nations, through UNRWA, through the World Food Program, and so forth. But even those organizations, once the food or the aid was passed into Gaza, has got to work with a local governing authority, and that's where this political issue is going to have to be joined sooner, I think, rather than later.
But Hamas indicated today that they would be willing to enter into some sort of unity government, and I'm just wondering, would that be a step that the new administration then would have the way to lead the world by saying, well, we're going to have to deal with this unity?
You know, I go back to my answer to the other question. But thank you for asking.
Yes, ma'am. The question is about what the role of the UN will be. The UN has not been a significant player, and now it seems that you said that it's going right on the carpet and taking an active part. Did I get that right? Yeah. Who is that for?
I think the United Nations is an important formal structure for pushing certain things along, but the clear resolution is going to come through the kind of hard bargaining that involves the powers concerned. And again, getting back to what I was trying to say in my penultimate remarks, is a smart power approach by the United States, not getting up front and trying to seize the initiative from others. They mentioned about the fact that there are several Arab states that have real concerns about Hamas is a great potential roadblock, but also working it out properly is a great boon. I think the United Nations structurally is important, but the real question is that working out of all of the people involved in a situation that can open up well, first things first, probably move us toward a unity government in Palestine, which is a very important first step.
One last question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, a very limited sort of technocratic question, I guess, for Ambassador Kurtzer or anyone else. The border between Gaza and Egypt is less than 8 miles long. How is it that there can't be some 8-mile security apparatus that would detect tunnel digging and stop the flow? Is it Egypt's unwillingness, in which case I'd like to hear you say something about it, or is it technologically infeasible for reasons that I can't understand?
There is something about that border that has been that has confounded anybody who watches it. Israel watched that border between 1967 and 2005, and as it left Gaza, it also left behind tunnels. So even Israel, when it was in control of one side of the border, was not able to stop the tunnels. So yes, there's an Egypt component here. Egypt has not been able to stop the tunnels on its side, but apparently is a far more challenging problem. Technology, yes, there are reports of new devices that may be able to detect tunneling deeper. There's questions being raised now about maybe a water barrier being used to stop some of the tunneling. And so there may be some technological fixes, but there are also some human problems to overcome. The Bedouin in Sinai have been conducting smuggling for far longer than the Arab-Israeli conflict has been in existence, and they are extraordinarily adept at getting around any of whatever the technology of the day suggests. So I think it's a combination of technology, of human will, of government will, and at the end of the day, there's still going to be some smuggling, but the idea is to, I think, get some kind of control over it.
Well, thank you all. This has been a very exciting panel.